It started with the wind. Not the howling kind that rattles your windows, but the slow, deliberate whispers that rustled the palmetto trees in the early morning and omens soft and ancient that every Floridian knows to respect. I had been up since before dawn sipping lukewarm coffee from my chipped army mug, watching the clouds roll in like they had purpose. My hands were steady, but my gut wasn't. We'd lived in the Marshfield Bluffs community for just over 4 years. A tidy suburban neighborhood near the Gulf governed by one of the strictest HOAs I'd ever encountered, and I'd seen a few. Retired now after 22 years in the National Guard and 5 years working with FEMA on post-disaster logistics, I thought I could enjoy some peace with my teenage son Matthew. But Marshfield Bluffs had its own kind of battleground ornamental mailbox, heights, lawn fertilizer codes, and God forbid, your shutters didn't match the designated pallet. But this wasn't about a mailbox. This was about survival. 3 days before NOAA issued a hurricane watch. Nothing out of the ordinary this time of year, but something about Eliza. The way she formed the pressure drops the silence before the wind, I knew this one was different. The model said it would skirt the coastline. My instincts screamed otherwise. So I did what I always do. I prepared. I brought out the storm wall panels I'd designed myself fiberglass, reinforced polymer lightweight, but built to withstand a Category 4 direct hit. I'd fabricated them over the past 2 hurricane seasons, storing them quietly in my garage under labeled bins. They weren't flashy. No neon orange or industrial scaffolding. Just clean storm gray panels I could slot together over the lower floor windows and patio walls. I started early, just as the wind picked up. By 6 a.m., I was placing the sandbags in front of the garage. They weren't technically approved by the HOA, but they were low profile and essential for redirecting runoff. Matthew helped me haul them from the truck bed, both of us working in a rhythm that required no words. He knew better than to ask questions about hurricanes. He remembered Mom. It wasn't even 8 a.m. before I heard the familiar crunch of cheap tires and the faux authority clip-clop of low heels on concrete. Karen. I didn't look up. I kept stacking even as she cleared her throat with a sharpness designed to cut. Mr. Callahan, she began, her voice sweetened with that forced professionalism I'd come to associate with condescension. Are you aware that any exterior modifications must be pre-approved by the HOA Architectural Committee? I stood slowly wiping sweat from my brow with the back of my gloved hand. They're storm panels, I said calmly. Temporary? Necessary. She crossed her arms, eyes scanning the setup like a predator analyzing a trap. Temporary or not, they're visible from the street. That violates Clause 4.6b regarding non-standard installations. The governor just issued a state of emergency last night, I replied. You might want to be more worried about wind shear than aesthetics. Karen smiled. Not a friendly smile, a tight, triumphant one. The kind of smile you see in courtroom sketches of people who just ruined someone's life with a technicality. I'm sure we all appreciate your initiative, she said. But the HOA has standards. There's no need to panic. The official forecast suggests only tropical storm conditions in our area. I felt the heat rise in my neck, not just from the humidity, but from the bitter weight of déjà vu. People always say that until the eye is overhead and the walls are vibrating. Behind her, Mr. Lyle, the HOA's compliance officer, more of a paper pusher than a real enforcer, was scribbling notes on a clipboard. He looked uncomfortable. I knew he didn't want to be there. But Karen ran the board now, and she was a stickler. Worse than that, she was new money with something to prove. Her mansion on Riverstone Drive was a showpiece complete with imported marble columns and a grand chandelier visible from the front lawn. It hadn't been built to endure anything real. I tried once more, measured and respectful. Karen, these panels can mean the difference between damage and devastation. I've built them to code higher than code actually. They'll be down within 24 hours of the storm passing. She ignored me, turned to Lyle. Write him up. Non-compliant storm defense structure visible from common areas without board approval. Immediate removal required. That was when I felt it. Not the wind, but something colder. Betrayal. Because in that moment, it didn't matter that I'd spent years coordinating disaster relief. Didn't matter that I'd buried my wife after Hurricane Melinda tore through her hospital when flood doors failed. None of it mattered to Karen. All she saw was a house on the corner that didn't look like the others, and a man who wouldn't bow. They left with a violation notice tucked neatly into the edge of my mailbox. I didn't tell Matthew. He was already tense, and I didn't need him resenting the HOA more than he already did. I just kept working. Reinforced the paneling, lowered the storm shutters, triple-checked the sealant around the window casings. By noon, the clouds had darkened like old bruises. Birds vanished from the trees. Still no official evacuation order, but I knew what was coming. Around 3 p.m., I got the email, immediate removal of unauthorized structures by sunset to avoid fines and escalation. It was signed, of course, Karen Dupree, HOA president. I stared at the screen, then at the panels, then back at the screen, and I made a choice. I removed the outermost layer, left just enough to blend in. The core reinforcements, hidden behind recessed siding and cleverly disguised storm-rated glass, stayed. Karen would think I complied, and if I was lucky, she'd be too busy polishing her wine cellar chandelier to notice otherwise. But if I was right, if the storm curved even a few degrees, she'd learn what I already knew. You don't argue with the wind, and you never ever remove the only wall standing between you and it. The next morning, I was on the ladder securing the last of the reinforced glass shutters when her golf cart pulled into my driveway like it owned the concrete beneath it. White and spotless with gold trim, because of course it had gold trim, it rolled to a stop as if choreographed. Karen stepped out, hair immaculate red, HOA windbreaker zipped halfway up like a badge of rank. Behind her, Lyle trudged behind with that same tired clipboard. I didn't look down at her immediately. I made her wait while I secured the final latch. A second of silence, then another. Only when I was safely grounded, wiping dust from my palms, did I acknowledge her. Karen, I said flatly. Lyle, I see you took our warning seriously, she said, gesturing toward the newly exposed siding. It looks much better, conforming to the neighborhood aesthetic again. Lyle didn't say anything. He shifted his weight from foot to foot like a man trying to avoid stepping in moral mud. I complied with your notice, I said, to the extent required. She squinted eyes scanning the edges of the house. It still feels fortified, not exactly standard. I used legal materials approved by county ordinance. Code 327B allows for reinforced siding in hurricane zones. Her lips pursed. This is an HOA-governed community, Mr. Callahan. The county may have its standards, but Marshfield Bluffs has its own identity. We maintain consistency for everyone's benefit. You mean appearance, I replied, too tired to sugarcoat. You want the street to look like a catalog. Meanwhile, Eliza is turning toward the Gulf with Category 4 wines. She folded her arms. The National Weather Service says it's downgraded. You seem overly concerned. I couldn't help it, I laughed. Just once, short bitter. You really think hurricanes follow forecasts like a polite guest follows an invitation? Karen's expression hardened. We don't tolerate sarcasm either. It sets a tone. A neighborhood is like a garden. Negativity is a weed. Behind her, Lyle scribbled something, though I doubted it was real. I leaned forward slightly. Do you know what happened in Punta Clara back in '08? I asked. Similar forecast. Slight tropical conditions predicted. Residents were told not to worry. They didn't board up. Didn't reinforce. Storm turned overnight. 23 dead. 47 homes reduced to splinters. She blinked, but said nothing. I was there, pulling bodies from what used to be kitchens. Karen opened her mouth, but I raised a hand. So if I sound negative, it's because I know what it's like when preparation is mistaken for paranoia. Lyle lowered his clipboard. He was listening now. Really listening. Karen, on the other hand, turned on her heel. You've been warned, she said. If any part of your modifications violate Marshfield Bluffs ordinance, the board reserves the right to fine and escalate further. She left without looking back. Lyle gave me an apologetic glance before following. I stood there for a long time watching the gold-trimmed cart vanish down the road. Wind tugged at my shirt. The smell of salt was stronger now. Matthew came outside holding his phone. Dad, it just changed. What did... The storm. He turned the screen toward me. Eliza's turning, headed straight up the coast. Landfall prediction just moved closer to us. They're saying it could hit by midnight. I took the phone from him. My stomach turned cold. The new track placed Marshfield Bluffs directly in the cone. I muttered, of course it is. We spent the next 2 hours rechecking supplies, water batteries, flashlights, radios. I had already secured the garage, reinforced the patio with the embedded storm frame I'd left behind. I considered boarding the front door, but that would definitely draw attention, and maybe a second HOA visit. Instead, I left the door as is and reinforced it from inside. The neighborhood was in that strange calm, that eerie lull before chaos. A few people were packing up to evacuate. Most weren't. I saw neighbors sipping wine on patios, kids playing in the yards, dogs being walked, like it was just another Thursday. Karen's mansion loomed 3 houses down, all elegance and columns, and glittering lights, not a single shutter in place. I watched her supervise 2 gardeners as they wrapped her hedges in plastic to protect the topiary design. That was what she was worried about. Hedge damage. By 6 p.m., the wind had picked up enough to whistle between the window frames. I could feel the pressure drop behind my eyes. That subtle primal sensation that animals feel before a quake. Matthew and I double-checked the generator. He didn't speak much, but I could tell he was nervous. He finally asked, "You think she'll be okay?" "Who?" "Karen. Her place. It's huge, but it doesn't look strong." I paused. "It's not. Looks like a fortress, but the windows aren't rated. Her columns are veneer. Roof's probably ornamental tile, good for fashion, not for hurricanes." "Why would she build like that?" "Because some people only plan for applause," I said. "Not for storms." By 9 p.m., the power flickered once, then again, then went out. We switched to battery lanterns. Radio buzzed with static and bursts of emergency updates. The last transmission before the signal failed. Eliza, now a strong Category 4. Landfall in less than 3 hours. Take shelter immediately. I looked at Matthew. Time to go down. We headed to the lower level. I secured the door, checked the bar lock reinforcements. The air was tense but silent, except for the wind growing in volume like a freight train slowly approaching. I sat against the inner wall flashlight resting between us, hand on Matthew's shoulder. And outside, somewhere in the distance, I could already hear the first tree snap. The walls breathed with the wind. That's the best way I can describe it. The whole house felt alive, like it was holding its breath along with us. Every creak and groan in the frame echoed memories I'd tried to bury under layers of routine and silence. Matthew sat beside me, legs pulled close, arms wrapped around his knees. I could see the reflection of the emergency lantern flickering in his eyes. He was brave, always had been. But this storm, this one felt different to both of us. The last time I heard wind like this, it stole my wife. Melinda died during Hurricane Melinda. The irony isn't lost on me. 6 years ago, the hospital generator failed during a storm that wasn't supposed to hit us directly. She was in the ICU after a routine appendectomy went sideways. She needed a ventilator. When the power cut out and backup systems failed, she didn't stand a chance. I'd been deployed at the time, ironically enough, helping FEMA coordinate response in another part of the state. I couldn't get to her in time. The guilt my old companion pressed on my chest harder than any hurricane ever could. That was the day I stopped trusting forecasts, stopped believing in the idea that official channels would always do the right thing. Since then, I've lived by 2 principles: prepare like the worst is coming, and never let someone else's comfort cost your survival. I didn't know then that Karen had once served on a local beautification board in Georgia before moving here. She had a background in luxury real estate, not safety. She believed in curb appeal, not codes. Her entire identity was woven around control of lawns, of letters of lives. She thought uniformity was order. But order without wisdom is just arrogance in a different outfit. She didn't know what it meant to lose everything to wind. But she would. Thunder cracked close enough to rattle a can off the basement shelf. I stood quickly, pressing my ear to the wall. I could hear it, not just the wind, but something more. The unmistakable roar of pressure systems colliding. The storm was here. I turned on the portable radio, hoping for an update, but it was only static now. Then the sound changed. A low, continuous groan, like the moaning of a giant metal beast. I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the small storm window near the top of the basement wall. It was reinforced glass, narrow but strong. Through the fog and rain-blurred glass, I saw the streetlights bend unnaturally, and then one simply vanished, snapping like a twig. "Matthew, get back from the wall," I said, voice sharp but calm. He obeyed instantly. And then came the noise I had dreaded, splintering somewhere close, too close. It wasn't from our house. It was from Karen's. I opened the window, just a crack enough to let sound in. The wind shrieked like an animal in pain. But beneath that, I heard it, wood tile and stone collapsing in rapid succession. And then, a scream. A woman's scream. Matthew looked at me, pale. "Was that—" "Yes, I didn't say her name." I rushed to the other window, peering through what little I could make out. Karen's estate, or what was left of it, was no longer a single structure. Part of the roof was gone, ripped clean. The grand portico obliterated. I could barely make out movement, but it looked like debris was flying from her backyard, like leaves from a tornado. I had no way of knowing what caused it at the time, but I'd later learn it was the underground wine cellar. She'd built it without permits. Imported marble and glass, no proper reinforcement, no drainage. When the ground became saturated and the wind pressure dropped around it, it created a vacuum beneath the structure. The collapse was inevitable. The storm howled into the early hours. We stayed low safe, every bolt I'd placed doing its job. The panels I'd left disguised, buried in the framework, held firm. The shutters didn't rattle, the frame didn't crack. By dawn, the wind slowed. Not stopped, but retreated like some beast dragging its claws back into the sea. I opened the door slowly, every muscle tense. Outside, the air smelled of salt, wet wood, and something electrical scorched almost metallic. Our street looked like a war zone. Trees were down everywhere. Roofs gone. Cars flipped. Shingles and debris littered the roads like broken promises. But our house stood. Karen's did not. I made my way outside, boots crunching against shattered tile. Matthew followed behind, eyes wide. I stepped cautiously over downed wires and splintered fences. Karen's property was unrecognizable. The second story had collapsed inward. What remained of the foyer wall was scattered across her once manicured lawn. The iron gates at the side of her home had twisted into a tangled knot of metal and shrubbery. And then I saw her. She was half buried under what looked like the remains of her grand staircase. Mud-streaked, shaking, bruised, but alive. She wasn't screaming anymore. She just stared at me, lips moving silently. I moved fast. Years of training kicked in. I didn't care that it was Karen. I didn't care about the fines, the notices, the humiliation. A human was trapped, and I knew how to get her out. I pulled the debris away piece by piece. Matthew helped, silent and efficient. Finally, with a cry of pain, we lifted the last beam and Karen collapsed forward into my arms. She sobbed, clutching my shirt, her pride, as shattered as the chandelier that used to hang in her foyer. I didn't say I told you so. I just whispered, "You're safe now. But you won't be if you stay here. This place isn't sound." I carried her to my home, her breath still ragged. I sat her down in the dry living room, gave her water. She stared around stunned and muttered, "How? How did your house?" I didn't answer. Not yet. But inside me a tide had turned. The woman who threatened me with violations had been buried under her own design choices. And now she would face the truth not from me, but from every authority that would follow. 3 days before the hurricane hit, I had done what any father and former FEMA officer would have done. I fortified my home against what I knew was coming. But less than 12 hours before landfall, they tore the visible parts of it all down. Karen didn't send a warning. There was no knock on my door, no civil conversation. Just a clipboard, a couple of clipboard-carrying HOA enforcers with bright orange vests and a smug order to remove the violations. And when I didn't respond, when I refused to back down from her lunacy, she escalated. She sent in contractors, not city contractors. Private ones local men probably hired under the table by her cousin, who ran a landscaping company up in Jacksonville. They pulled up in 2 unmarked trucks just before sunset, loud engines rumbling over the sound of sirens in the distance, as the county issued a voluntary evacuation for zones 1 through 4. I was on my porch with Matthew when the trucks arrived. Daddy said quietly, "Those aren't city workers." "No," I said, stepping down the stairs, "they're worse." One man jumped out with bolt cutters. Another brought a crowbar. And right behind them, in that damn golf cart of hers, came Karen, arms folded across her chest, like she was the sheriff of some windswept ghost town. "Stop," I said firmly as I walked toward them. "You do not have permission to touch my property." Karen hopped down from the cart, wind blowing her hair in all directions, but she didn't flinch. "Mr. Callahan, your unauthorized structures are in direct violation of Marshfield Bluffs Regulation 3.2.6. You were given written notice and time to comply. You didn't. There's a Category 4 hurricane hours away," I said, motioning to the sky that had turned a sickly gray-green. "If you take that wall down, it won't just be cosmetic damage, you're putting lives at risk. The HOA cannot and will not be liable for individuals who defy our regulations," she replied, raising her chin. "These men have been instructed to remove non-compliant structures. If you interfere, we'll consider it obstruction. Matthew stepped beside me, fists clenched. You're insane. Karen didn't even look at him. I turned to the men. You touch that wall, you better be ready to replace it when your houses collapse. This isn't some backyard pergola. It's a structural storm defense, built to specs higher than anything your laminated playbook could ever understand. One of the workers paused uncertain. The other looked to Karen. She doubled down. Do it. And they did. They started with the side paneling, prying it away from the anchors with crowbars. I shouted. Matthew tried to pull one of them off the wall. They pushed him back. I grabbed him before it turned ugly. Karen watched, satisfied, as the panels were pulled one by one. My sandbags were tossed aside like garbage, the reinforced plates stacked in the bed of one of their trucks like scrap metal. The work was loud, brutal, and methodical. By the time they finished, the sun had nearly disappeared, and the first raindrops were falling like quiet threats from the sky. I stood there, fists clenched, jaw tight, as the trucks drove away with everything I had built. My home vulnerable again. My son silent with rage. Karen victorious for now. You've put this whole block at risk, I told her as she got back into the cart. Storms come and go, she said with a shrug. Community standards last forever. And then she left. I didn't speak as I walked back inside. Matthew followed me, dragging the last of our emergency supplies into the hallway. We sealed the back windows, locked the lower rooms, and triple-checked the generator. The house felt naked. Even though I knew I'd hidden the critical inner reinforcements behind architectural facades, even though I had designed redundancies Karen couldn't see, it still felt like she'd stripped us bare. Not just the house, me. She didn't just dismantle a storm wall. She reminded me that power in the hands of the ignorant is more dangerous than any hurricane. By 10 p.m., the winds had begun their siege. Our lights flickered. The house groaned. Somewhere a neighbor's car alarm blared and didn't stop. From the basement, we listened to the storm test, every joint, every beam, every nail in the structure. Then just past midnight, a sound like thunder but deeper, closer. Boom. The windows shook. A picture frame fell off the mantel upstairs. Was that? Matthew whispered. Karen's place, I said quietly, or what's left of it. I wasn't wrong. When I checked the emergency radio, the only thing that came through was the sheriff's department dispatch. We've got a full collapse on Riverstone. Partial structure failure. Trapped individuals suspected. Avoid area until further notice. All units prioritize search and rescue. Matthew looked at me pale. Do we help? I nodded. If it's safe, we do. We didn't sleep. Just sat waiting for daylight. Waiting to move. Waiting for the storm to either pass or finish what it started. I couldn't shake the image of Karen standing there hours earlier barking orders, completely confident she could control everything with a clipboard and a threat. And now, likely buried under the mess her ego created. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired. Tired of people like her deciding that appearances matter more than preparation. That rules matter more than lives. That they could use community codes as weapons to punish those who dared to think for themselves. The thing about hurricanes is they don't care about your authority. Neither do consequences. The wind was howling now louder than I'd ever heard it in this neighborhood. I tightened the straps on my boots. There'd be cleanup tomorrow. Maybe death. Maybe lawsuits. But first, there would be a reckoning. And Karen Dupree would learn that the only thing more unstoppable than a hurricane is the truth it leaves behind. It began with a silence so complete it made the walls hum. A lull that felt like someone had paused the entire world for breath. Even the radio static quieted. Matthew looked up at me, eyes wide. I didn't need a forecast to tell me what was next. Eliza's eye, I said. I stood slowly and walked to the basement storm hatch, careful not to let the inner lights spill out too far. I cracked it open just enough to peer out. The world outside looked unreal, as if someone had drained all the color from the sky. Everything was still too still, the kind of stillness that makes every hair on your arm stand up. And then it came. Not as a whisper this time. The wind returned like a scream. A wall of noise hit our house like a freight train. It wasn't the gusts, it was pressure. The kind that crushes your ears and makes the floor vibrate beneath your feet. The windows above ground groaned under the force, even the ones I'd reinforced. Every nail, every bracket, every panel was being tested all at once. We braced in the basement, emergency lanterns, glowing dimly, batteries humming low. I checked my watch, 1:27 a.m. Outside, things were coming apart. I heard wood snap. A high-pitched metallic squeal. Somewhere close, glass exploded. Not a crash, an implosion. Like the air had been yanked out of a house. I thought of my neighbors, the ones who hadn't prepared. The ones who had trusted Karen when she dismissed the forecasts. The ones who had sided with her at the board meetings rolled their eyes when I warned them about code compliance, wind resistance ratings, storm surge. I tried to stop myself from thinking about who might not make it to morning. I heard a scream, distant, cut short. Matthew clutched my arm. Was that? Maybe a structure failing, I said. I hoped I was lying. Something slammed against the side of our house, hard. The whole foundation shook, but the walls held. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the secondary hatch inside the storage nook, a narrow reinforced shaft that connected to a sealed access point in the garage floor. I'd designed it after Melinda died, my personal escape route, in case everything else failed. The hatch was dry. I checked the barometer on the wall. It had dropped 20 millibars in under an hour. This storm was worse than anything they had predicted. It wasn't just a hurricane. It was a reckoning. At 2:08 a.m., the roof of the vacant Mackenzie house 2 doors down lifted clean off. We heard the rafters tear like tissue paper. I could picture it, wood splinters swirling through the air like arrows. That house had been built fast. For resale value, not resilience. Not like mine. Matthew was silent beside me, arms wrapped around his knees again. His lips moved in what looked like a prayer, though he never said it aloud. I knelt beside him and said, "You're safe. We did everything right." He didn't nod. He just leaned his shoulder into mine. That was all the response I needed. Around 2:40, the wind shifted slightly. Not just intensity, but direction. It meant the eye wall was moving. Maybe we were on the backside now. Maybe it was beginning to pass. That's when the phone buzzed. Weak signal. A text pushed through, mangled and partial. Emerge. NCY structure. Karen. Collapse. Send help. No name attached. Just a blinking gray bubble from an unknown number. Likely one of her staff. Maybe a worker. Maybe Lyle. Karen's mansion was gone. I had seen the roof start to cave before the storm blinded the view. But if there was even a chance someone was still alive in that wreckage, I couldn't sit still. "I'm going out," I said. Matthew grabbed my wrist. "You're insane. The wind's still." "I know." I opened the garage access. My reinforced door was scratched, dented, but intact. The truck, covered in sand and debris, had one cracked mirror, but seemed operable. I loaded emergency gear, crowbar, med kit, battery-powered cutters, flare gun. I wore the old FEMA harness, helmet, flood boots. All of it still fit. Habit never left your body, not when it was survival that once paid your mortgage. At 3:15, I stepped into the storm. The wind shoved me sideways, tore at my jacket. Sand hit my face like broken glass. Visibility was near zero, but I knew the street by heart. The moment I stepped past the ruins of the Mackenzie house, I saw it. Karen's mansion was gone. Not damaged, not partially collapsed. Gone. The front pillars shattered. The east wall collapsed inward. Debris piled against her neighbor's fence like driftwood. The roof sheared completely away. I climbed over chunks of marble tile, twisted iron from the balcony railing, parts of her imported French doors. I called out, "Karen." A cough. I turned. A hand half buried in wet drywall and insulation moved weakly beneath what looked like half a staircase. "Hold on," I shouted. It wasn't just Karen. 2 bodies were beneath the rubble, Karen and a younger woman I recognized from the HOA office, maybe an assistant. Karen's face was cut, her arm bent at an odd angle. The girl was unconscious, face bruised but breathing. "Help us," Karen whispered, barely audible over the wind. I set to work. It took 23 minutes to dig them out using a crowbar and brute strength I hadn't summoned since the Haiti quake in 2010. Every board I lifted felt heavier than the last. My back screamed, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. By the time I got them clear, the wind had started to calm. Karen stared at me with a strange expression. Shame, maybe. Or just shock. I thought, "Your wall," she murmured. I didn't answer. I led them back to my house. Matthew opened the door wide. We pulled them inside. The lights flickered, backup power still holding. Karen collapsed onto the floor, shivering. I handed her a blanket and knelt down. "You're lucky," I said softly. "Most of your house is in someone else's yard." She didn't reply. The storm continued to rage outside. But in that moment, I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Not dominance, not control, not disdain. Gratitude. And something else that almost looked like regret. The sun rose not with warmth, but with gray-shrouded shame. From the upstairs window of my house, one of the few still intact in Marshfield Bluffs, I could see the broken bones of the neighborhood. Trees snapped in half like matchsticks. Roof shingles were scattered like autumn leaves. Sidewalks were invisible beneath a carpet of insulation sheet metal, downed power lines, and debris. And then, like the centerpiece of an ironic sculpture garden, sat what was once Karen Dupree's prized mansion. What remained of it, anyway. From this height and angle, you could see the cross-section of her grand design, each room laid bare, as though peeled by some cruel wind. The wine cellar collapsed, the east-facing sunroom obliterated, her cherished columned facade reduced to cracked stumps. I'd seen war zones that looked more organized than the debris field that now stretched across what used to be her manicured lawn. Matthew stood beside me, clutching a mug of powdered cocoa. His voice was quiet. Her place didn't stand a chance. No, I said, because it was never built to. We had spent the last few hours tending to Karen and the young assistant, who I'd learned was named Brielle. She was barely 20 and shaken to the bone. Karen hadn't spoken much. Her arm was likely fractured, her lips cracked and dry. But it wasn't the physical pain that had quieted her. It was something else entirely. Humiliation. I wasn't cruel. I didn't say anything when she struggled to meet my eyes. I didn't mention the HOA fine, the threat, the dismantling of my storm wall. I didn't even bring up the fact that the only reason she was alive was because the very house she tried to correct had saved her from being buried under her own. But she knew. You could see it in the way she refused to speak, in the way she flinched every time the wind rattled the shutter even though the worst had passed. At 8:30 a.m., I turned on the emergency ham radio. FEMA had set up a triage center on the northern side of the county. Rescue teams were being dispatched. The National Guard had mobilized. But the roads were blocked. Power lines were down. It would be hours, maybe longer, before help would reach this part of town. That meant I had work to do. By 9 a.m., I was moving through the neighborhood boots, thick with mud, shirt clinging to my back. I carried a backpack filled with med kits, dry rations, and duct tape. It sounds strange, but duct tape in a post-hurricane zone is a miracle. You can bind, seal, strap, reinforce. It's the battlefield tourniquet of suburbia. The Parker family had a tree fall through their garage roof. Their minivan was totaled, but they were alive. The elderly couple on Bayleaf Court had barricaded themselves in their walk-in closet and were nearly suffocated by lack of ventilation. The Thompson boy had a gash across his thigh from falling glass. I stitched him up with trembling fingers while his mother wept and held his hand. Everywhere I went, people asked the same question, "How did your house survive?" And I kept giving the same answer, because I didn't listen to the board. I didn't say Karen's name. I didn't need to. By midday, word had spread about the collapse, about the wine cellar, about the unpermitted construction that likely weakened the entire foundation. The whispers turned into quiet outrage. HOA residents, once devout followers of every rule Karen laid down, were now staring at the wreckage of their own lives, asking why they were told to take down shutters or delay reinforcements until the HOA gave the green light. The truth was leaking out faster than the water damage spreading through their drywall. And then came the drone. I heard it before I saw it. A soft, persistent hum. I looked up and spotted a black quadcopter hovering just above the treetops. It had a small blinking red light and a camera suspended beneath. Someone was documenting the damage. A journalist, a local storm chaser. Didn't matter. The drone focused squarely on Karen's lot. It hovered there slow and deliberate, capturing every angle of the destruction. Then it pivoted to my house. Still standing. Intact. My panels, though partially removed by Karen's team, were now clearly visible beneath the remaining reinforcements. The structural integrity was evident. The contrast could not have been more obvious. One mansion leveled, one modest home left untouched. A tale of two philosophies. Later that evening, as we gathered in my living room around battery lanterns and shared crackers and peanut butter, Karen finally spoke. I made a mistake. The words dropped into the room like a bomb. Matthew froze mid-bite. Brielle looked up from the floor, eyes wide. I kept my gaze steady. Which one? Karen looked down at her lap, her fractured arm wrapped tightly in a sling made from one of my old towels. All of them, she whispered. I thought if we controlled the visual order of the neighborhood, we were making it safer, cleaner, better. I let the silence answer her. You warned me, she added. You tried to tell me. I took a slow breath. You didn't listen. Her voice cracked. No, I didn't. It was the most human I had ever seen her. No makeup, no polish. Just a broken woman in the remains of a false kingdom, sitting in the home she'd once threatened to fine out of existence. I built that cellar, she confessed, quieter now. My brother told me it wasn't up to code, but I paid extra to have it sealed. I thought it made the place look more valuable. Elegant. Elegance doesn't matter when the ceiling falls, I said. She didn't cry. Not yet. But her lips trembled as she looked around the room. At the walls still standing. The quiet hum of a backup generator. The boy curled up in the armchair beside her still hole. You saved me, she said. Why? I didn't answer right away. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the flashlight beam on the ceiling. Because that's what neighbors are supposed to do. Even when they're wrong. Even when they're cruel. She flinched. I didn't say it to wound. I said it because it was true. And sometimes truth is the storm we need most. By the time the first rescue crews rolled into Marshfield Bluffs, it had already become clear that we weren't just another neighborhood hit by a hurricane. We were a case study in negligence, vanity, and what happens when appearance is prioritized over preparedness. I saw it in the eyes of the paramedics as they stepped over collapsed garden arches and shattered wrought iron fences. I saw it in the way FEMA surveyors stared at Karen's mansion-turned-crater and then slowly turned to face my house, standing whole, not untouched but resilient. I even saw it in the expression of the fire chief, a man I hadn't spoken to in over a decade, who approached me with a quiet nod and said, "You saved more than just your family, Callahan." They started setting up mobile triage centers by the golf course. Helicopters circled above, dropping emergency supplies onto streets that no longer had names because the signs had been ripped out of the earth like weeds. Karen hadn't left my living room since the night I pulled her from the wreckage. She'd refused medical evacuation until Brielle had been taken out first. A small gesture, but one I hadn't expected from her. I watched from the porch as stretchers moved in both directions. There were injuries, a few critical. No confirmed fatalities yet, but people were missing, buried under collapsed garages inside homes where no one had thought to check the roof bolts or reinforce attic trusses. And the whispers had grown louder. The HOA, once feared, had become the villain of every broken porch conversation. Why were we told not to board up windows? Didn't they say storm shutters had to match the trim color? Wasn't Karen the one who sent out that memo about avoiding panic behavior? It didn't take long for those whispers to turn into something louder, official. By day 2, a city inspector named Torres showed up with a clipboard thicker than a phone book. He wore a vest that read, "Building Compliance Emergency Reinstatement," and moved through the neighborhood with the intensity of someone who'd seen this kind of failure before. I invited him in for coffee after he stopped in front of my house and just stared for several minutes. "This place looks untouched," he said. "Reinforced foundation," I replied. "Storm-rated fasteners, laminated hurricane glass behind decorative shutters, and a storm wall that was mostly removed by HOA contractors just before the storm hit." He turned sharp. "Say that again." I handed him a photo time-stamped, printed from my emergency wireless printer. It showed Karen's workers prying off the panels, with her standing in the background, arms folded like a general on the battlefield. Torres whistled low. "Mind if I ask?" He said, "How'd you know what to build?" "FEMA," I said simply. "I worked logistics for 7 years, saw what happened when people trusted appearances more than structure." He nodded. "You built for the storm. They built for a magazine cover." I showed him my blueprints, my permits, the initial approvals I'd submitted, and that had been overridden by the HOA Architectural Committee citing aesthetic disruptions and non-uniform exterior modifications. He didn't say much, but he took everything I gave him and walked out with a face like thunder. The next morning, Karen was gone, not missing, relocated. A city vehicle came to collect her. An officer I recognized from the County Enforcement Division accompanied her to the door. She didn't make eye contact as she stepped outside. Her arm was still in a sling and her mouth was a tight, resigned line. She paused briefly on my porch. "I understand if you never forgive me," she said. I didn't reply. She looked out over what remained of her kingdom, then back at me. "They're launching a formal investigation," she said. "The board's liability. My liability." She glanced down at the floor. "I shouldn't have removed your wall." I exhaled slow and steady. "You shouldn't have tried to run a neighborhood like a gated illusion." She nodded. "The illusion's gone now." As the car pulled away, I saw Brielle watching from the back seat. She gave me a small tentative wave, and then they were gone. That afternoon, the HOA board sent out an email, or what was left of them did. 2 members had resigned. 1 was missing. The message was short and filled with phrases like deep regret, internal review, and temporary suspension of enforcement policies, pending municipal coordination. The neighborhood was shifting. People who had once kept their heads down were now speaking up. Men like Mr. DeGrasse, who had been fined $400 for building a privacy fence too tall, were now asking why those funds never went toward emergency readiness. Parents questioned why the HOA never hosted a single hurricane prep meeting, even though we lived in a surge zone. And amid it all, my phone started ringing. Reporters, local channels, one from a major national outlet. They all wanted to know the same thing: how had my house survived? I didn't say much, just one sentence. Because I built for what was coming, not what people wanted to see. They liked that. It made the news crawl under footage of flooded cul-de-sacs and collapsed porticos. The drone footage went viral. People debated HOA overreach on social media. Hashtags trended. A woman from Michigan emailed me saying she forwarded my story to her own HOA after they denied her request to install storm-rated windows. By the end of the week, Marshfield Bluffs had been visited by city engineers, federal safety auditors, and 2 separate legal teams. The HOA office, or what was left of it, had been boarded up. No one was answering their phone line anymore. Karen's name had quietly disappeared from the HOA website. The board was no longer functioning. For the first time in its existence, Marshfield Bluffs was HOA-less. And still my home stood. Not because it was immune, but because I didn't wait for permission to protect it. That night, I sat with Matthew on the back steps of our house, looking out over a horizon littered with broken dreams and the beginnings of something new. He asked, "Do you think it'll go back to the way it was?" I shook my head. No, and it shouldn't. We sat in silence a while longer, listening to the wind softer, now gentler. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't bracing for the next hit. I was just breathing. 2 weeks after the storm, Marshfield Bluffs didn't look like Marshfield Bluffs anymore. Where there used to be pristine hedges and matching color palettes, now there were tarps flapping over gaping roof holes, piles of debris lining cracked driveways, and every other mailbox taped with notices. Structural assessment pending. But there was also something else in the air now, something we hadn't had before. Honesty. It crept in quietly like the mold blooming on drywall, only this time, it wasn't toxic. It was liberating. On the 3rd Monday after the storm, city inspectors returned with a small team of forensic engineers to do a formal damage assessment. I was asked to walk them through my build design panel by panel. The lead engineer, a lean, fast-talking woman named Sarah Ngo, examined my blueprints with a reverence I hadn't expected. "Did you seriously build this all yourself?" she asked, eyebrows raised. "With some help from my son," I said, nodding toward Matthew, who was wiping his hands with a rag near the garage. "Your storm wall, it absorbed force laterally and vertically," she said, flipping through the photos. "Even after partial removal, the interior reinforcements held. I've seen commercial safe rooms that performed worse than this." She wasn't exaggerating. The post-storm drone footage had been shared with several national engineering bodies. Apparently, a few design schools were already discussing my setup in class. I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt a grim weight in my chest. Because, as she praised my house, I knew what they'd found a few streets over what was left of Karen's wine cellar. Sarah had visited the site earlier that morning. She told me what they discovered. The entire substructure of Karen's estate had been illegally excavated. The underground room lacked proper moisture barriers. Most damming of all the support beams had been rerouted through an old, unapproved blueprint signed by Karen's brother, who wasn't a licensed contractor. "There's enough code violation in that hole to fill a courthouse," she said grimly. And that's exactly where the city planned to take it. Later that day, I was asked to give an official statement for the county attorney's investigation into HOA negligence and unauthorized construction. I wasn't the only one. Dozens of neighbors had come forward. Old inspection reports were resurfacing. Fines that had been levied for non-standard paint colors now looked more like revenue schemes than rule enforcement. Even Lyle, the clipboard guy, showed up at my door looking smaller than I remembered him. "She made us ignore the permits," he said, hands shaking slightly. We tried to push back, but she said she'd have us removed from the committee. Said the optics were more important than over-engineering. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt. When he was done, he looked at me with watery eyes and whispered I should have stood up. "I knew you were right." I nodded. But you still have time to do the right thing now. Lyle testified 2 days later. That was the turning point. It started with the city issuing a temporary cease on all HOA enforcement across the district. Then the local newspaper published an expose on Karen's leadership, calling it a case of architectural vanity with fatal implications. FEMA officials, who had been quietly monitoring Marshfield Bluffs, added our neighborhood to a federal audit list for pre-storm code violations. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to me. A national network offered to fly me out for an interview. I declined. I wasn't interested in headlines. I just wanted change. Real, tangible change. But the calls kept coming. Then one day, Matthew handed me a yellow envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note on fine stationery. You were right. About the wind, about the walls, about all of it. I failed this community, not just in leadership, but in listening. The truth is louder than any storm now. I won't fight the investigation. I won't make excuses. I'll answer for what I did. Thank you for pulling me out of the wreckage twice. Karen. I stared at the paper for a long time. It was the first real apology I'd ever received from her, and perhaps the last. That same week, I was asked to speak at the community's first public town hall since the storm. Not a board meeting. Not a HOA affair. A town-organized session for residents, homeowners, and city officials. When I arrived at the community center gymnasium, I didn't expect much, but it was full. Standing room only. I took the podium slowly. My boots left faint traces of dried mud on the wood stage. The mic squealed once before going silent. I looked out at all the faces, familiar and strange. Faces that had once looked away when Karen barked orders. Faces that had received fines and stayed silent. Faces of people who now knew what it meant to be vulnerable. I cleared my throat and began. I've lived here for 4 years. Long enough to know that rules can build a community, but only if they're rooted in care. We followed rules about mailbox colors, while ignoring the fact that most of our homes were built like paper dolls. A few people nodded. I tried to reinforce my house. I continued. Not to prove a point, but to survive. And when the wall came down, I thought, maybe we'd go down with it. I paused. But we didn't. I turned slightly, eyes scanning the room. Because walls aren't just what you build with your hands. They're also what you stand for when everyone else is too scared to stand alone. The silence was deep and respectful. Then the applause came slow, uncertain, then swelling like the wind itself. A standing ovation. I didn't bask in it. I just stepped down and returned to my seat beside Matthew. Later that night, he turned to me as we walked home, hands in his jacket pockets. You think this changes anything long term? I don't know, I said truthfully, but it's a start. He looked around at the darkened homes, some with plastic still stapled over missing walls. Some with lights finally flickering back on. Feels different now. That's because it is, I said. The storm exposed more than wood and concrete. It exposed how fragile trust is when power goes unchecked. We walked the rest of the way in silence, the moonlight falling softly across the ruins of what once was order and what now might become something better. It didn't take long for the legal hammer to fall. By the 3rd week after Hurricane Eliza, the HOA board, that once lorded over Marshfield Bluffs like a neighborhood monarchy, had unraveled completely. One by one, board members resigned. Some fled the state. Others lawyered up. Karen, to her credit, or perhaps because she no longer had the strength to fight, remained cooperative through the investigation. But cooperation didn't mean exemption. The county district attorney's office announced a formal inquiry into the Marshfield Bluffs HOA for gross negligence, misuse of funds, obstruction of emergency preparedness, and endangerment of residents through unlawful code enforcement. I didn't celebrate when I heard the news. I just sat on my porch with a mug of black coffee, watching as a city utility truck worked to clear a fallen streetlight that had pinned down an entire camellia bush. It was all too heavy for celebration. Matthew joined me with a folded newspaper under his arm. We made the front page again, he said. I took the paper expecting to see more drone images of Karen's collapsed mansion or a headshot of me taken from some old driver's license database. But it wasn't either. It was a photo of my house standing proud, framed by wreckage on both sides. Beneath the image, the headline read, "And the man who built quietly and survived loudly." I almost laughed, but there was no humor in it, just a strange ache in my chest. A few hours later, two FEMA officials stopped by. They asked if I'd be willing to walk them through a community-wide disaster readiness assessment. Not for Marshfield Bluffs, for other neighborhoods statewide. Apparently, word had spread to other counties, even other states, about what had happened here. "They're calling you a civilian case study," one of them said, grinning. "Most storm-proof designs we see come from university labs or military contractors. You built yours in a two-car garage with recycled panels and hurricane intuition." I shrugged. I built it because I lost someone. They didn't ask who. They didn't need to. The silence said enough. After they left, I went back inside and pulled out the blue folder I kept buried in the desk drawer. Inside were Melinda's final medical records. A picture of her in scrubs, smiling in front of the hospital where she worked. I traced her name with my finger. "I finally made something that held," I whispered. Later that afternoon, something strange happened. A letter arrived. An actual letter, hand-delivered, no postage. It was folded neatly and clipped with a gold paperclip. The letterhead read, "City of Clearwater Heights, Legal Office." It was a notification that Marshfield Bluffs HOA had been formally suspended by emergency ordinance. Pending investigation outcomes, all HOA enforcement authority was revoked. Furthermore, the city had decided to initiate a pilot program, community-elected neighborhood stewards focused on safety-first planning, emergency education, and transparent spending. And they wanted me to be the first steward. At first, I balked. I wasn't a politician. I didn't crave power. I wanted peace, not another battlefield. But then I thought about it. If I didn't step up, someone else might, someone like Karen with a new haircut and a softer tone, but the same obsession with order over empathy. So I said yes. We held the first official meeting in the rebuilt gymnasium. No matching chairs, no scripted pledges. Just folding tables, water jugs, and a whiteboard with "What did we learn?" scribbled across the top. People came with their own folding chairs. They brought photos, broken fence posts, waterlogged fines. Some came just to listen. And then, something beautiful happened. A man I barely knew, a neighbor, who once reported me for having non-neutral brickwork, stood up and apologized in front of everyone. "I didn't understand back then," he said. "I just thought keeping everything matching made us safer. I was wrong." Then another woman stood up. "I was fined for having a backup generator," she said. "They said it made the lawn look commercial. But it saved my mother's life last week." One by one, stories poured out, each one like a brick being removed from a wall that had separated us for years. And I just listened. That's all I'd ever wanted. A neighborhood where people listened. That night after the meeting, Matthew and I stood outside under the stars. The air still carried a faint dampness from the storm, but it was fresh, renewed. "Do you think they'll vote you in permanently?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "But I'm not building walls anymore. I'm building bridges." He grinned. "Still reinforcing them though, right?" I smiled back, always. Over the next few days, FEMA set up a volunteer relief station out of our garage. We distributed supplies, coordinated cleanup crews, and checked in on seniors too proud to admit they needed help. The old HOA building, once a temple to red tape and fear, was being converted into a community shelter. I was asked to cut the ribbon. When I stood in front of the crowd, scissors in hand, I looked over at the empty chair that had once belonged to Karen during board meetings. It felt surreal. She hadn't returned to the neighborhood since her deposition. Some said she moved upstate to live with her sister. Others claimed she was still meeting with lawyers. But I hoped wherever she was, she finally understood. The walls we build, literal or not, should protect, not divide. I cut the ribbon. Applause followed. And I realized something that night. Sometimes storms don't just destroy what was weak. They clear space for something stronger to be built. The sound of hammers and drills returned to Marshfield Bluffs, but this time it wasn't about conformity. It was about restoration and resilience. 4 weeks after the storm, my front yard was no longer a target for fines or a symbol of a rebellion. It was a construction site again, only now no one came by with clipboards or veiled threats. Instead, they came with questions. What kind of screws did you use on the lower reinforcements? Where did you source the paneling? Would you be willing to help us draw something similar? I helped where I could. I brought out diagrams, hosted workshops, printed laminated guides for basic stormproofing. Matthew joked that I was starting to look like a community prepper guru, and maybe I was. But it felt good not to be feared, not to be dismissed, but to be heard. The city had made its decision. Final Marshfield Bluffs would never again operate under a private HOA. Instead, the new community council would be funded by optional contributions, with all financial statements publicly disclosed. No more mysterious fines. No more weaponized bylaws. And in the center of it all, my wall went back up, this time without protest. It wasn't the same wall, though. That one had been dismantled and hauled off like garbage under Karen's orders. No, this new one was sturdier, sharper. Built not in defiance, but with the full support of neighbors who now understood why it mattered. A small group gathered the day we finished installing the last panel. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just a quiet sense of completion. Matthew handed me a cold bottle of root beer and sat down on the porch step beside me. You know, he said, I was scared you'd move us after all this. I turned to him. I thought about it. For a long time. But we don't run from wind. He nodded, satisfied. Later that night, as we grilled hot dogs for some of the volunteers who helped with cleanup, an unfamiliar car pulled up. Out stepped a woman in gray slacks and a pale blue cardigan. Her arm was still bandaged. Karen. The porch quieted. You could hear the grill sizzle. A few people stood up instinctively. Others just stared. She walked slowly, one hand gripping a manila envelope. She looked thinner, older somehow. I met her halfway down the walk. I heard she said softly, about the shelter, about the council. I waited. I know I don't belong here anymore, she said. But I couldn't leave without saying something in person. She handed me the envelope. Inside was a personal check, a large one, made out to Marshfield Bluffs Community Recovery Fund. I sold what was left of the property, she said, and I liquidated the wine inventory, the real one, not the fake cellar I used for show. You didn't have to, I began. Yes, I did, she said firmly this time. You saved my life, and not just in the storm. You saved me from myself. I just didn't see it until there was nothing left to protect but the truth. I nodded quietly. She took a deep breath. If you ever rebuild the wall again. I already did, I said gently. She managed a small, sad smile. Good, this time. I hope people see it for what it really is. And then she left. I didn't follow. I sat back down beside Matthew, watching the wall shimmer under the porch lights. Not flashy, not symmetrical, but strong. A week later, a letter arrived from the governor's office. The state was launching a community resilience initiative focused on training homeowners in disaster preparedness and construction. They wanted to base the pilot in Marshfield Bluffs. They asked me to lead the curriculum. I said yes, because that's what this had always been about, not proving people wrong, but showing them what was right. Over the following months, Marshfield Bluffs transformed. Not into what it was before, but into something far better. Kids rode their bikes past homes with storm shutters and solar backups. Neighbors traded tips on structural integrity over coffee. We installed community lockers with emergency supplies built by volunteers and stocked by donations. And nobody complained about sandbags anymore. I still think about Melinda. Every time the wind picks up, every time a forecast crosses the screen, I picture her face calm and kind, framed by hospital scrubs and soft curls. She didn't get a second chance, but maybe she gave us ours. One afternoon, I stood at the edge of the rebuilt wall, palm resting on the final panel. I closed my eyes and let the wind pass through my shirt across my neck, up into the sky where so many stories begin and end. And in that moment, I didn't feel like a man who'd won a war with an HOA. I felt like a man who had finally quietly helped others survive. And that was enough.